Who was Sweyn Forkbeard? While Sweyn was a very interesting character, he became the king of Denmark after the death of his father, Harald Bluetooth. Denmark came easy for him, but then he really had to fight for Norway, and later in his life he had to fight for England. And he was the first outside invader to do so since the Great Heathen Army. If you haven't seen my other videos in this series, that's okay, but what I'm going to try to do is look at Sweyn Forkbeard's life chronologically, and to do that I have to start with his birth. Sweyn Haraldsson was born around 960 to King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and Norway. It's usually stated that Sweyn's mother was the Swedish princess Gunhild or Geirith, but it's also possible that he was the son of Bluetooth's later wife Tove or Tofa, who was a Slavic princess. Although there are some variations, there's a general narrative told about the origin of Sweyn Forkbeard, and it involves another woman as his mother. I will be summarizing a part of the Jomsvikings Saga, at least for this part of the video, but the same story can be found from different sources with only a few different minor details. It states that when King Harald had a feast on the island of Finn, he slept with a woman named Isa. 3 or 4 years later, when Harald came back to the island, Isa told King Harald that her now 3-year-old son, Sweyn, was his. He refused to take care of the boy, and Sweyn was taken care of by a man named Paunatoki until he was 15 years old. And Paunatoki was a pagan chieftain on Finn, and he was the leader of the Jomsvikings. At this time, Paunatoki told Sweyn to find his father and demand resources from him so he could go Viking. Harald Bluetooth, thinking that he only had to pay this price to keep Sweyn away from him, provided him with 3 ships and 120 men, while Paunatoki provided him with an additional 3 ships. Possibly under the manipulation of Paunatoki, Sweyn and his men slaughtered and ravaged in Zealand and Halland, parts within the Kingdom of Denmark itself. But when King Harald was told about what was happening, he refused to do anything about it. The next summer, Sweyn asked his father for twice as many ships as last time, and Harald granted Sweyn with them. Again, Sweyn destroyed parts of his father's kingdom. For a 3rd summer in a row, Sweyn went Viking in Denmark, and Harald Bluetooth finally had enough. King Harald went with 50 ships to finally put an end to Sweyn. After a day of long sea battles between the men of King Harald and the men of Paunatoki and Sweyn, Harald's men decided to camp on the island of Bornholm for the night. Paunatoki, with 11 of his men, decided to stay on the island as well. They saw a campfire in the distance and made their way towards it. Paunatoki saw King Harald warming himself by the campfire, and with an arrow shot King Harald. Harald Bluetooth retreated to Jomsborg in Wenland, a part of his kingdom, and died from his wounds. Later, an assembly was held and Sweyn was elected to be the new king of Denmark in 986. It's clear that in this story, Sweyn was highly influenced by Paunatoki, who was the closest thing he had to a father. With Paunatoki being a strong believer in the pagan faith, it would not be surprising if his motives for manipulating Sweyn were religious ones. And this does make sense, especially considering that Harald Bluetooth was the first Danish king to be baptized and to try to Christianize his country. Some who believe in at least parts of this story think that Sweyn was a strong believer in the pagan gods, and this really would not be a far stretch. Although Adam of Bremen tells that Sweyn was baptized, he writes that King Forkbeard persecuted the Christians in Denmark. Thietmar of Meersburg also painted Sweyn out to be an exceptionally cruel to Christians, so again it's possible that Sweyn was a pagan and anti-Christian. But later in his life it seems that he embraces Christianity and is at least passive about paganism, but the reasoning for this may have only been political. Later in the Jomsvikings Saga, it tells that Paunatoki, after Sweyn is elected king, established the city of Jomsborg and the legendary Jomsvikings. But we know this isn't true because Jomsborg and the Jomsvikings were already mentioned in earlier sources. It's most likely that it was Harald Bluetooth who established Jomsborg, and Paunatoki was the one who took control of the area, but he was still under the control of Sweyn. When Harald Bluetooth took control of Norway, he placed a vassal king named Hakon Sigurdsson. Because Hakon was such a strong believer in the old gods, he broke his alliance with Denmark after Bluetooth attempted to force Christianity into Norway. And at this point, he is essentially running Norway uninterrupted by the Danes. This all changed when King Sweyn sent the Jomsvikings to Norway to slay or push out Hakon Sigurdsson, and to assert Danish control over the land once again. The Jomsvikings reached the western coast of Norway somewhere around r.986 in 986. The Jomsvikings were met by a Norwegian force more than twice their size led by Hakon Sigurdsson himself, along with his sons Eric and Sweyn Hakonsson. Now this was known as the Battle of Hjørungavag. A good source from this battle is actually from the perspective of the Norwegians, and it's told in the Olav Tryggvason Saga. And this portion of the saga really shows how intense the battle was, but it also shows just some insight and how cocky and proud the Norwegians were about this battle. And really, it's just amusing. Go ahead and skip the video forward a little bit if you care to. But it states, "The band ships along the coast sailed on to meet the foeman's host. The stout Earl ships with eagle flight rushed on the Danes in bloody fight. The Danish ships of courtmen full were cleared of men in many a hull. Was driving empty on the main with the warm corpses of the slain. 'Twas at the peep of day our brave Earl led the way, his ocean horses bounding, his war horns loudly sounding. No joyful morn arose for young Frey's base foes. These Christian island men wished themselves home again. The ring-linked coat of strongest mail could not withstand the iron hail, though sewed with care and elbow bent, by Norn on its strength intent. The fire of battle raged around, Odin's steel shirt flew all unbound. The Earl his ring-mail from him flung, its steel rings on the wet deck rung. Part of it fell into the sea, a part was kept a proof to be. How sharp and thick the arrow flights among the sea steeds in this fight." So I hope you got something out of that. I really just enjoy putting some primary or secondary sources in all my videos. After the defeat of the Jomsvikings, Sweyn didn't take any notice to the continuation of Hakon Sigurdsson's rule and left Norway alone, at least for now. There's a mystery as to what Sweyn was doing in between the years of 990 and 995, because there's a lot of evidence that contradicts each other. Some sources claim that between these years he built churches in Denmark, and some sources claim that he went Viking in Saxony, Frisia, and then the British Isles. Sometimes it's said that he went Viking because he was exiled, but when he returned to Denmark it seems that his authority was put back into place. That is, if he ever actually lost his authority at all. The King's Saga tells that Sweyn was at one point captured by Sigvaldi Stråtharaldsson, and he was the successor of Palnatoki and therefore the new leader of the Jomsvikings. In order to escape, Sigvaldi ordered King Sweyn to marry the Wendish or Polish king Borislav's daughter, Princess Gunhild. Sweyn accepted as Sigvaldi said, and he married Gunhild. We know that at some point in this time frame, Sweyn's first son Harald was born, and then his second son Canute. At around 995, a revolution happened in Norway and Hakon Sigurdsson was killed by Olav Tryggvason, and Olav claimed the throne of Norway for himself. After Olav forcefully converts much of Norway to Christianity, he proposes marriage with the now widowed Queen Sigrid Storada of Sweden, but that is only if she converts to Christianity. Sigrid refuses, and according to the King's Saga, Olaf struck Sigrid across the face with his glove. Shortly after, Sweyn makes a political move. He already had an alliance and friendship with Sigrid's now deceased husband, Eric the Victorious, so he proposed marriage with Sigrid as well. He did not expect her to convert to Christianity, and the marriage went through, creating a strong alliance between Denmark and Sweden. It's not known what happened to Sweyn's first wife, Gunhild of Wendland. Some may assume that she had died, perhaps he simply abandoned their marriage, which could explain why Sweyn sent his sister, Thyri, to marry Gunhild's father, King Borislav of Wendland. To complicate things even further, Thyri fled to Norway and married King Olaf. Around the year 1000, Olaf was returning to Norway from a trip to Wendland. While around the Danish Isles, he crossed paths with Sweyn in a large Danish fleet. The Danish and Norwegian ships met and a fierce battle started. This was known as the Battle of Svolder. This time, the Danes outnumbered the Norwegians. The Danes, with the help of some Swedish allies, now defeated most of Olaf's men. And in order to escape a cruel capturing or death, King Olaf Tryggvason jumped into the sea with a full suit of armor. With the defeat of King Olaf, southeastern Norway was now under the direct control of Denmark once again. Other parts of Norway were more loosely controlled by Sweyn, and some of eastern Norway was now incorporated into Sweden. Finally, now that Scandinavia is at relative peace, King Sweyn can turn his attention to England. England's history with the Vikings go as far as the beginning of the Vikings. The largest invasion was, of course, the Danish Great Heathen Army in 865, and the Great Heathen Army was famously but only supposedly led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. And Ragnar Lothbrok was also an ancestor of the dynasty Sweyn was part of. The Danish controlled most of England for more than a decade until Alfred the Great defeated them in battle. It's actually somewhat surprising how little detail is known about Sweyn from this point on. The Danes' actions at this time are not recorded as much in Scandinavian sources but from Anglo-Saxon sources, especially the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which tells us nearly everything we need to know about Sweyn's invasion of England. So please forgive me for how contrasting the second part of the video will be to the first. The English sources just don't have the narrative force that the Norse sources have, and also can get a little confusing because the Danes often attack the same places over and over and over again, so it's difficult to keep track of where they were at all times. There was already a sizable Norse population in Britain after Alfred the Great's defeat of the Vikings, but Viking raids slowed down for quite some time. That is until around 980. Some believe that this is due to a weakening of monarchical power, but I think a lot of it is still a mystery. England was highly affected by this new way of raids and eventually began to send Danegeld to Denmark, but over time the protection money became higher and higher. This is why you'll find that in this time, more Anglo-Saxon coins were found in Denmark than in England itself. King Sweyn and therefore Denmark was thriving at the time with all of this external income. 991 was the time of the famous Battle of Maldon, which is now known from the Anglo-Saxon poem of the same name, and then in 1002, King Athelred II married Emma of Normandy to gain political power. Then in the same year, because of the high tension between the Anglo-Saxons and Danes, Athelred proposed a consequential action to kill every Dane in England, or at least every Danish male. This became known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre. Historians have conflicting opinions on just how much of a massacre this was. Some claim it was an all-out genocide, while others proposed more modest ideas. What we do know for sure is that the St. Brice's Day Massacre was a significant step in Sweyn's conquest of England. In the massacre, Sweyn's sister Gunhild and her husband Peleg Tokison were slain. A year later, in 1003, the Danes' series of revenge raids started. Sweyn's countrymen first raided Wessex, specifically targeting Exeter, an English city which Athelred recently gave to his new wife, Emma of Normandy. The city was almost completely demolished. Perhaps this showed Athelred what Forkbeard thought about his alliance with Normandy and England. In 1004, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells of Officer Snillinger, and he attempted to buy a truce with Sweyn, but the Danes ignored the offer and marched into the city of Thetford, where a local militia made the Danes suffer significant losses. The Danes were able to escape and left East Anglia, at least for the time being. In 1006 they attacked Kent, and in the winter, Sweyn and his men traveled from the south, starting at the Isle of Wight, and came as far as Hampshire and then into the city of Reading. England was devastated and unsure what to do. A massive amount of money was still being spent on Danegelds, and they were never really sure if the Vikings would keep their promises, and often they didn't. In this time period, we see England grow into a more Christian nation, and if you're wondering what I mean, I can explain that by saying, it was common at the time for Anglo-Saxon Christians to look at the Vikings as God's way of punishment. Athelred seemed to be asking for mercy. He commanded his people to fast, he commanded priests to sing, and he made it so that any man who chose to desert his army also chose to desert his property and life. Most surprisingly is probably that he changed the design of the English coin from a classic portrait to the symbols of the Lamb of God and the dove, which represents the Holy Spirit, and it's probably a wish for peace. In 1009, the raids turned into something much larger. Thorkel the Tall, a prominent Jomsviking, started these attacks. He led a large group of Danes, possibly with the help of the Jomsvikings themselves, and they arrived at the abandoned harbor of Sandwich. And then they made their way to Canterbury, where they were paid £3,000 to spare the people. The Danes also decided to, once again, work their way north from the south. First the Isle of Wight again, and then into Hampshire again. Perhaps feeling threatened by Athelred's new national army, which is mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. In the winter, the Vikings moved out of Hampshire and moved into Kent again. And the Danes did not rest in the winter. They used this time to pillage parts of Kent and then nearby Essex. They failed in an attempt to raid London, but made their way to Oxford. That is almost 200 kilometers or 120 miles away from where they docked their ships in the beginning of winter. In the spring of 1010, the Danes now in East Anglia faced a great challenge. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells of Ulfsætel Snillingur, the before-mentioned East Anglian elderman who attempted to buy the Danes away. Now, almost a decade after he forced the Danes to retreat, he was the leader of an East Anglian army. The Danes, probably with revenge in their minds, were eager for battle, as they apparently voluntarily marched towards Ulfsætel's army. Keeping in mind its biases, I think the Chronicle can tell it better than I can, and it's a little long, but this is the entire section of text written for 1010. This year came the aforesaid army, after Easter, into East Anglia, and went up at Ipswich, marching continually till they came where they understood Ulfsætel was with his army. This was on the day called the first of the Ascension of our Lord. The East Angles soon fled. Cambridgeshire stood firm against them. There was slain Athelstan, the king's relative, and Alswy, and his son, and Wulfric, son of Leofwin, and Edwy, brother of Effi, and many other good thanes, and a multitude of the people. Thurketel Muirhead first began the fight, and the Danes remained masters of the field of slaughter. There were they horsed, and afterwards took possession of East Anglia, where they plundered and burned 3 months, and then proceeded further into the wild fens, slaying both men and cattle, and burning throughout the fens. Thetford also they burned, and Cambridge, and afterwards they sent back southwards into the Thames, and the horsemen rode towards the ships. Then went they westward into Oxfordshire, and hence to Buckinghamshire, and so along the Ouse, till they came to Bedford, and so forth to Thamesford, always burning as they went. Then returned they to their ships with their spoil, which they appointed to the ships. When the king's army should have gone out to meet them as they went up, then went they home. And when they were in the east, then the army detained in the west. And when they were in the south, then was the army in the north. Then all the privy council were summoned before the king, to consult how they might defend this country. But whatever was advised, it stood not a month. At a length there was not a chief that would collect an army, but each fled as he could. No shire, moreover, would stand by another. Before the feast day of St. Andrew came the enemy to Northampton, and soon burned the town, and took as much spoil thereabout as they would, and then returned over the Thames into Wessex, and so by Canning's Marsh, burning all the way. When they had gone as far as they would, then came they by midwinter to their ships. So in these next 2 years the Danes were pretty successful. They plundered new parts of England, and they returned to these parts that they've been making miserable for the past few decades. And up until this point, it's unknown how involved Sweyn was with these new raids of England. A few sources mention Sweyn, and a lot even say he was in England during these pillages. It's also possible that Sweyn did not play that big of a role in England, but I wouldn't know how to explain the lack of information about what he was doing in Denmark at the time. The weakening of England could have been a decade-long strategy planned by Forkbeard. Regardless of what he's done until this point, we know that Sweyn took the opportunity given to him by the raids to rule England. In 1013, King Forkbeard, along with his son Canute, landed with his fleet in Sandwich with the intention of becoming the King of England. First he went north through East Anglia and up to the coast of northern England. The kingdom of Northumbria and Lindsey apparently took almost no effort for Sweyn to take control, and the 5 boroughs of Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford all came next. To make the people submit, Sweyn's forces took hostages from the shires and waited for the approval of their new king. Next, Sweyn used the same tactics in Oxford and then in Winchester. London resisted the forces of Forkbeard until hearing of the conquest of Bath. Then London was the last of England to surrender. After this, all seemed hopeless to Athelred. He and his sons, Edward and Alfred, retreated to Normandy. Not soon after, Sweyn Forkbeard, on Christmas Day, 1013, was supposedly elected King of England by the British people. If this was the case, I'm sure it was very helpful that Sweyn at least gave the impression of being Christian to the English people. King Forkbeard of England settled himself in Gainsborough. Only 5 weeks after his new title, Sweyn died on February 3rd, 1014, at 54 years old. There are multiple accounts of the cause of his death. Some say he died from falling off a horse or from internal bleeding. Sweyn's body was taken back to Denmark. Some say he was buried in Lund, and some say that he was buried in a church built by his father in Roskilde. It's really surprising how quickly Sweyn took England, and that's probably because before he arrived, the Danes already did most of the work for him. I think the English were already in a pretty dark place, and they were ready for some stability. I think it's very interesting how Sweyn Forkbeard started as you know, the disappointing son of Harald Bluetooth, but he grew into someone who I think would have made his father proud. He really had big shoes to fill, and he did a fantastic job. The Danes, after 100 years, were able to take complete control of England once again, something they probably felt destined to do. Shortly after Sweyn's death, there is some trouble, and Athelred does reclaim England for at least a little bit. That is until Sweyn's son Canute takes over again and creates what we know as the North Sea Empire. And for the Danes, I think I mentioned this in my video about Harald Bluetooth, but the Danes looked at England as an entitlement. All this research made me realize what an underrated historical figure Sweyn really was. Okay, I just want to say thank you so much for watching, and I hope my content is progressing in some sense. This is my longest video, so thanks for hanging in there.